Hi, welcome to the second part of my beginner's tutorial about how to use your camera. In this video, I'm going to cover exposure and how shutter speed, aperture and ISO can be changed to affect this. If you haven't seen part one of this series, I've put a link up here and down below in the comments so you can go and check that out. That's all about focusing. Let's explain what we mean by the term exposure. Now, in its simplest terms, getting the correct exposure means that the picture will not be too bright or too dark, and somewhere in the middle is what we're aiming for. Now, I do use the term correct exposure advisedly because it's a little bit subjective. If you're trying to get a silhouette of a tree in front of a sunset, then you'll want to expose for the sun so the sun isn't too bright and the tree becomes completely black. I'll come on to details about how to achieve this shortly. One thing to be aware of is that the camera sees the world very differently from your eye. Your eye can see a much wider range of tones, from deep shadows to bright highlights at any one time. And this is known as the dynamic range. It's the same within the camera. Now, modern cameras can increasingly see a larger range of tones, so they're getting a better dynamic range. But they still do struggle when faced with dark shadows and bright highlights in the same shot. This is why taking photographs in bright sunlight can be a problem. The range of tones is just too great for the camera to record. You want to try and get detail in the shadows, but you don't want to burn out the highlights, which mean the highlights go completely white and lose all detail. In this shot, the sky is burnt out and has no detail. To get the correct exposure, you have to control the amount of light that enters the camera and hits the sensor. Now, this is fairly simple. The more light that enters the camera, the brighter the image. The less light that enters the camera, the darker the image. As I mentioned earlier, there are three controls that change how much light enters the camera. They are aperture, shutter speed and ISO. And it's really important that you understand how to control these settings to change the amount of light that enters the camera, but also to understand how changing these settings also changes the look of your photographs, because this is important when you want to start being creative. I'm going to start with shutter speed as it's the most straightforward to understand. Now, I have a model here to demonstrate the principle of how shutter speed works. First of all, imagine a set of curtains that open and close when you press the shutter button. When the curtains open, light enters the camera and falls on the sensor. Now you can set how long the curtains stay open for. So the longer the curtains stay open, the more light enters the camera and therefore the brighter the image will be. If you open the curtains for a brief amount of time, a lot less light enters the camera. Now, the actual shutter in a camera does work slightly different than this model, but the principle is still the same. Changing how long the shutter is open for will affect the way that your shot looks, and so you need to decide what you want to achieve from the shot before setting the shutter speed. In these two images, I've changed just the shutter speed. In the first image, I chose a slow shutter speed of 1/10 of a second. This has resulted in the running water becoming blurred. This could be used to show movement in a photograph. The second image has a quicker shutter speed of 1/160th of a second, resulting in the water becoming frozen. These two images show further effects of shutter speed. The slow shutter speed has created an almost ghostly self-portrait, and the fast shutter speed has frozen the motorbike as it raced past. However, the motorbike shot looks too static. There's no sense of movement. If you consider these final images, as I slowed the shutter speed, the movement of the rotor blades became more evident. I personally think the helicopter in the final image looks more like it is flying rather than the first one that looks more like it's been suspended in mid-air. Next, we're going to look at aperture. Now, the principle is quite straightforward. If you think of a lens, inside the lens there is an aperture or diaphragm that opens and closes the same as your iris does in your eye. I'm going to use this model to try and demonstrate aperture. I have two glass cylinders, and in the top of the cylinders I have two cups. one with a small hole in the bottom and one with a large hole in the bottom. And then I have 2 cups of water that I've coloured green just so you can see it a little bit better when I pour it into the cylinders. The water represents light entering the camera. Then I've got the small hole in this cup, which represents a small aperture, a larger hole in this cup, which represents a larger aperture. The bottom of the cylinders would be where the sensor would be positioned. As we pour the water into each cup, note how quickly the water pours through. So here, with the large aperture, the water is filled up very quickly, whereas the water is still filling up with the small aperture. And this can be applied to the way that the aperture works in a camera. The large aperture lets more light through much more quickly. The size of the aperture is indicated by an F number. What often causes confusion is that the aperture gets smaller as the F number gets larger. So therefore an aperture of f2.8 lets in more light than an aperture of f8. Changing the aperture also has an effect on the way that your image looks. The image on the left was taken with a large aperture, and this has resulted in only a few of the buttons on the remote control being in focus. In the second image, I used a small aperture, and most of the image is in focus. The amount of the image that is acceptably sharp is referred to as the depth of field. I do have several videos that go into depth of field in a lot more detail, so I've linked these down below in the comments. The final setting that can affect exposure is ISO. Now, I'm using this voice recorder at the moment to record the audio on this video. On the recorder is a dial that is used to change the recording level of the microphone. As you turn the dial up, the level of the microphone increases as well. But if you increase the dial too far, then the microphone runs the risk of distorting. You can think of ISO as something similar to this, but instead of sensitivity to sound, ISO changes how sensitive the camera is to light. As you turn up the ISO, the camera becomes more sensitive to light and effectively the image becomes brighter. However, like a microphone will distort, an image will degrade as ISO values increase. This is evident in the form of noise being added to the image. Aperture, shutter speed and ISO all form an interconnected triangle, and as you alter one, you may have to balance that up by altering another to make sure that the exposure stays balanced. You may have noticed a histogram on the back of your camera that looks like the one on the screen now. See your manual for details of how to display yours if you're not sure. A histogram is a graph of tones from black on the left to white on the right. Everything in between are midtones. The top histogram is overexposed, meaning that the image would be too bright with burnt out highlights. The bottom histogram is underexposed, resulting in a dark image. The middle histogram is what you want to aim for, as a full range of tones have been recorded. If you set your camera to auto exposure, then the camera will decide the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO for you to give you a good exposure. Sometimes though the camera does get this wrong, and you can override the camera's decision by changing the exposure compensation. If the image is too bright, for instance, you can dial in some negative exposure compensation, and this will allow you to take a little bit of control over the image that you get from the camera. However, using auto exposure does limit how creative you can be with your shots, because effectively you're handing all of the decision-making processes to the camera. Many people do feel very nervous about turning off the auto exposure, but it's the only way to start to really develop your understanding of how the camera works and start to improve your photography. But don't worry, there are several ways within the camera to help you still get the correct exposure, and the first are the semi-automatic exposure modes. By selecting aperture priority, that's A on a Nikon or AV on a Canon, the user can set the aperture. That gives them control over the depth of field. Once you've set the aperture, this then stays locked and the camera then changes all the other settings to ensure you get a good exposure. I personally prefer to set the ISO manually, but you can let the camera decide and set this to automatic. But I only change it if the image is too dark and I can't make it brighter any other way, then I raise the ISO to enable me to get the correct exposure. If it is important to freeze the image, then select shutter priority. This is S on a Nikon or TV on a Canon. What this does is it allows you to choose the shutter speed based on the effect that you want to create, and then again the camera takes care of all the rest. And finally you can go into full manual mode, and in this setting the user controls the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO to get the desired effect. Experimenting with this mode is a great way to understand the function of your camera and how all the three settings affect one another. Getting the correct exposure isn't as hard as you might think. Within the camera there is a meter that helps you decide on what the correct exposure should be. On my live view monitor here, there is a series of lines going from a plus to a minus with a 0 in the middle, and this is replicated within the viewfinder. Now what I can do is, if I increase the shutter speed, it brings those lines closer to the 0 until they disappear, and this means that the shot is correctly exposed. I can also do the same thing with the aperture. If I widen the aperture, again overexposes the image, but if I then make the aperture smaller, the lines get closer to the 0, and when they're on the 0 like this, then I have got the correct exposure. You also have a choice of 3 metering modes, which basically tells the camera how to assess the exposure. The first is matrix metering, so the camera samples the whole frame to ensure a balance between dark and light areas. The second is center weighted, and the camera takes a reading from the center of the frame. The final metering mode is spot metering, and this takes a reading from the active focus point. This table gives an indication about how the settings are related. Changing the f-stop from f8 to 11 halves the amount of light entering the camera because you've made the aperture smaller. To achieve the same exposure, you have to leave the shutter open for double the time. Each change has to be balanced with another. Perhaps pause the video and take a bit of time to study this table and see how changing one setting is balanced by changing another. One thing to bear in mind if you're hand holding your camera is your decision about shutter speed, because if your shutter speed is too slow, it can introduce camera shake into your images. So a good rule of thumb to help you decide the correct shutter speed is to think about the focal length of your lens. So if I set the focal length to say 50 millimeters, then double that to give you 100, and then apply this to the shutter speed to give you 1/100th of a second, and this should allow you to comfortably handhold and take sharp shots. Aperture values can provide an additional level of confusion. The numbers don't follow a logical arithmetic system and instead come from the ratio of focal length to the diameter of the aperture. In this image, the F numbers each half the amount of light allowed through the aperture. Finally, it's important to review your images, and your camera will have several ways to assist you to do this. The first and most obvious way to check the exposure is to have a look at the image on the back of the camera to see if it looks okay. A more accurate way to check your exposure is to look at the histogram. What you're looking for is a peak in the middle like the one on the screen, but make sure that none of the graph hangs off the left-hand edge or the right-hand edge, because this will mean that you've over or underexposed certain parts of the image. Another very useful feature is the highlight warnings, sometimes known as blinkies. Turn these on and they'll start flashing if you've overexposed any areas. This is really useful information because if you burn out areas by overexposing them, then it's impossible to get any detail from this area even by putting it in the computer, because there'll only be pure white in this area. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. But the only way to fully get to grips with exposure is to keep practicing, to fully understand how all the different settings affect one another and give you the results that you're looking for. The goal is for it to become completely intuitive, so you don't have to think about what you're doing before you do it. But it doesn't happen without lots of effort and practice. So while you're stuck at home in the garden, get your cameras out and just experiment and have some fun. Thanks for watching. My next video is going to cover how to take a good photograph, thinking about things like composition and how to frame a photograph. Hope you can join me for that. Don't forget to like and subscribe, but for now, stay safe and I'll see you soon.